My wife filed for divorce and tried to lock me in a psychiatric ward, claiming my mind was completely gone. But during the final hearing, my 10-year-old daughter stood up, looked the judge dead in the eye, and asked, "May I show you something that Dad doesn't even know about, Your Honor?" The judge nodded. When the video started playing on the courtroom monitors, the entire room froze in absolute silence. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The air inside the Wayne County Family Court was freezing, carrying that sterile, unforgiving chill that seems to seep straight into your bones. I sat at the heavy oak defense table, staring down at my own hands. They were trembling. It was a visible, rhythmic shaking that I could not control, no matter how hard I pressed my palms against the polished wood. I am Garrett Whitlock. I am 70 years old. I have spent the last 4 decades building a commercial real estate empire in Detroit, from absolutely nothing. I have negotiated with ruthless developers, survived market crashes, and commanded boardrooms with an iron fist. But in that moment, sitting under the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom, I looked exactly like the broken, senile old man they were trying to prove I was. Across the aisle from me sat Vivian. She is 45 years old, and she has been my wife for the last 12 years. She was wearing a modest, dark, tailored dress, her hair pulled back simply, completely stripped of the lavish diamonds and designer labels I had bought her over the past decade. She was playing a role, and she was playing it flawlessly. As she sat there, she gently dabbed at the corners of her eyes with a crumpled tissue, her shoulders shaking with silent, calculated sobs. Anitzment. She looked like the perfect image of a terrified, exhausted, and battered spouse. Standing right beside her was her high-priced attorney, a man whose hourly rate was undoubtedly being paid by my own bank accounts. He was holding up a thick medical file, brandishing it toward the judge like a weapon. He was speaking with a grave, theatrical tone, declaring to the court that my condition had deteriorated rapidly. He claimed that I was suffering from severe, sudden-onset dementia. He read fabricated reports stating that my mind was completely unhinged, that I was prone to violent outbursts, and that I had become a direct physical threat to my family, especially to my young daughter. Listening to those words, a suffocating panic began to rise in my chest. The conflict hit me with the force of a freight train. I was not just sitting there fighting for my bank accounts, my properties, or my company. I was fighting for my basic human freedom. If the judge believed this performance, if that gavel came down in Vivian's favor, I would be stripped of all my legal rights. I would be locked away in a closed psychiatric ward, treated like a prisoner in my own mind, while she and her accomplices liquidated everything I had bled to build. Watching her squeeze out another fake tear, my mind forcefully pulled me backward. The transition was seamless, dragging me right back to the exact moment my entire reality shattered. It was exactly 3 months ago. The trembling in my hands had only just begun to surface back then. I was sitting at the head of the massive mahogany table in the boardroom of my company, Whitlock Development. The room was surrounded by floor-to-ceiling glass windows, offering a panoramic view of the Detroit skyline, a skyline I had helped shape. I was in the middle of reviewing a highly sensitive, multi-million-dollar commercial acquisition. My top executives were gathered around me, hanging on my every word. I was in complete control. Then the heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open. It was not my secretary who walked in. It was a man in a cheap suit carrying a thick stack of manila envelopes. He bypassed my security, walked straight up to the head of the table, and dropped the heavy envelopes right onto the acquisition documents. He looked me in the eye and stated loudly, "Garrett Whitlock, you have been served." The silence in that boardroom was absolute. My executives stared in shock. My own hands felt numb as I pulled the papers from the envelope. It was a petition for divorce, filed by Vivian, accompanied by an emergency restraining order, barring me from my own home, and a preliminary injunction freezing my personal assets. The documents alleged that I was mentally unstable, dangerous, and completely incapable of making rational decisions. The sheer humiliation of being served with a restraining order in front of my entire board of directors was a calculated strike. It was designed to undermine my authority, to make my colleagues question my competence, and to publicly emasculate me in the very empire I had created. I remember the chaotic rush of blood to my ears that day. I remember the confused murmurs of my team as I abruptly adjourned the meeting. I remember the desperate, frantic drive back to my estate, praying that it was some kind of massive misunderstanding, a terrible mistake. But there was no mistake. Now, returning to the present moment in the freezing courtroom, the memory of that humiliation fueled a silent, burning rage inside me. I looked away from the judge and focused my gaze on Vivian. She was lowering the tissue from her eyes, and for a fraction of a second, her gaze met mine. The terrified victim persona vanished, replaced by a cold, hollow emptiness. I looked down at her hands resting on the plaintiff's table. They were perfectly manicured, steady, and poised. Those were the hands that had poured my coffee every morning. Those were the hands that had adjusted my tie before every major corporate gala. And now, those were the exact same hands holding the legal knife to my throat. I looked at the fake medical file her lawyer was waving around, and then back to my own trembling fingers. I had spent my entire life relying on my intellect. My brain was my greatest asset. To hear a lawyer stand in open court and declare that my greatest asset was rotting away was a psychological torture I cannot fully describe. I remember staring at the medical seals on those documents, wondering if they were somehow right. Was I losing my mind? Were the memory lapses real? The aggressive moments? It is a terrifying thing when the person you sleep next to every night tells you that you are going crazy and presents a stack of papers to prove it. You start to second-guess every word you speak, every step you take. But the coldness in Vivian's eyes when she dropped her act for that split second told me a different story. It told me that the trembling in my hands was not a disease. It was a symptom of something far more sinister. I just needed to prove it. I left the boardroom in blind shock. The silence from my board members followed me into the hallway, thick and heavy with unspoken questions. The murmurs of my executives faded into a dull ringing in my ears as I took the elevator down to the garage. The concrete walls of the parking structure felt like they were closing in on me. My hands gripped the steering wheel with desperate, white-knuckled force. The drive to my estate usually took 40 minutes, but I made it in 20. I ignored the speed limits, running 2 red lights, my heart hammering a chaotic rhythm against my ribs. My mind raced through 1,000 scenarios trying to justify the catastrophic event. I told myself it was a massive misunderstanding, a clerical error, a malicious prank played by a bitter competitor. Vivian loved me. We had built a life together. There had to be a rational explanation. But when I turned my car onto the familiar tree-lined street of my neighborhood, the illusion evaporated. The massive oaks that usually welcomed me home now cast long, menacing shadows across the pavement. I pulled up to the wrought iron gates of the home I had built from the ground up, a home I owned long before Vivian entered my life. I rolled down the window, and punched my access code into the keypad. A harsh red light blinked back at me. I typed it again, slower this time. Red light. I tried Vivian's code. Red light. I tried the master override code I programmed myself 15 years ago. Red light. The system had been completely wiped. A cold sweat broke across my forehead as I stepped out of the car. I walked up to the iron bars and peered through. Stacked haphazardly on the cobblestone driveway was my luggage. 6 expensive leather suitcases, bulging and hastily zipped, dumped outside like garbage. Beside them were boxes overflowing with my personal files, books, and framed photographs from my home office. They had not just locked me out, they had erased my presence from the property. Before I could process the magnitude of the betrayal, the heavy mahogany door opened. I expected to see Vivian, perhaps looking apologetic, perhaps ready to explain the temporary insanity that had gripped her. Instead, stepping out onto the porch was Spencer. He was 42 years old, Vivian's son from a previous marriage. I had taken him in when he was just a lost young man with no direction. I paid for his education. I mentored him. 5 years ago, against the advice of my senior partners, I had appointed him as the chief financial officer of Whitlock Development. I had given him the keys to the kingdom because I believed in him as if he were my own flesh and blood. Spencer walked slowly down the driveway, his hands tucked casually into the pockets of his tailored slacks. He did not look angry. He did not look malicious. He stopped just on the other side of the iron gate, looking at me through the bars with an expression of profound, sickeningly sweet concern. He let out a heavy sigh, shaking his head slightly. "Dad," he said, his voice soft and dripping with fake sympathy. "You should not be out here driving yourself in your condition." I grabbed the cold iron bars, my knuckles turning white. "What condition, Spencer?" I demanded, my voice shaking with a mixture of rage and fear. "Open this gate right now. Where is your mother? What is the meaning of the garbage bags on my driveway?" Spencer took a step closer, placing his hand gently over mine on the gate. It was a gesture so condescending, it made my stomach turn. "The doctors say your mind is deteriorating, Dad. We have all seen it over the past 6 months. The memory lapses, the aggressive outbursts, the confusion. We are doing this to protect you, and to protect the company. The board is fully aware of the situation, and they agree with the medical assessment. We cannot allow an unstable man to pilot a billion-dollar ship into an iceberg. You need to step back and let the competent people handle the mess you have created. You are simply not well." I felt a cold chill wash over my entire body. I stared at the boy I had raised, searching his eyes for a hint of a joke, a sign of humanity. There was none, only a hollow, calculated calm. "I am perfectly fine," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "You have no right to do this. This is my house. This is my property. I built everything you are standing on." Spencer offered a sad, patronizing smile. "I know you believe that, Dad, but your perception of reality is slipping. The legal papers have already been filed. The judge reviewed your medical history and agreed that you need an immediate intervention. I will take over the daily operations at the firm until you get better. We have arranged for you to stay at a very comfortable, specialized hotel downtown. Your bags have everything you need. You do not need to worry about a thing anymore. Just rest." His words hit me like physical blows. He was weaponizing the very symptoms I had been experiencing, twisting the strange fatigue and dizziness I had felt recently into a narrative of irreversible mental decay. He was calmly staging a coup, using my health against me. I wanted to throttle him. I wanted to scream. But then my eyes darted past his shoulder, moving up the mansion. There, on the second floor, a small figure stood in the window of the corner bedroom. It was Elsie, my 10-year-old biological daughter, my precious girl. She was pressing her small hands against the glass, looking down at me. Her face was not confused. It was pale with pure, unadulterated terror. Her wide eyes were locked onto mine, pleading, desperate. She looked like a prisoner, trapped behind enemy lines. I opened my mouth to call out her name, to tell her that her father was still here, that I would never abandon her. But before a single sound could leave my throat, a shadow loomed behind her in the window. It was Vivian. I saw the flash of my wife's manicured hand grab Elsie roughly by the shoulder. Vivian did not even look down at me. With one violent, sweeping motion, she yanked the heavy velvet curtain completely shut. The window went dark. The connection to my daughter was severed in an instant. I stood there frozen on the pavement. The crisp afternoon wind whipped around me, but I could not feel the cold. I could only feel the devastating reality settling into my bones. Spencer turned away from the gate, walking back up the driveway toward the house without looking back. He stepped inside and pulled the heavy door shut, leaving me completely alone on the outside of my own existence. My entire life was gone forever. I was 70 years old, standing alone on the street with trembling hands, stripped of everything I had ever built. The heavy oak doors of the estate remained shut, sealing me out of the life I had meticulously crafted. A private car service, arranged no doubt by Spencer to ensure my quiet removal, eventually pulled up to the curb. The driver loaded my hastily packed bags into the trunk without making eye contact. I sank into the leather seat, the tremor in my hands now spreading to my chest, a deep, vibrating hum of pure panic. The drive into the city was a blur of neon lights and gray pavement. I was deposited at an upscale, but entirely soulless long-stay hotel in the heart of the financial district. The concierge handed me a keycard with a rehearsed smile of professional pity. Walking into that suite was like stepping into a high-end mausoleum. The walls were a flat, uninspired beige. The furniture was sharp, modern, and completely devoid of any personal warmth. There were no photographs, no familiar scents, no history, just pristine carpets and the deafening, oppressive hum of the central air conditioning. I dropped my coat onto the stiff sofa and stood in the center of the room. The isolation was immediate and terrifying. For 40 years, my days had been orchestrated chaos, ringing phones, demanding executives, architectural blueprints, and the vibrant noise of a busy household. Now there was nothing but silence. I looked at the 6 leather suitcases, grouped by the door. They contained the fragmented remains of my entire existence. I felt a sudden sharp pain behind my eyes, a dizzying wave that forced me to sit heavily on the edge of the perfectly made bed. I held my hands out in front of me. They were shaking. The tremor was not just a nervous reaction to the day's trauma. It was a rhythmic, mechanical spasm that I could not will away. I stared at my own fingers, trying to command them to stop. They refused. The terror that had been simmering beneath the surface for months finally boiled over. The gaslighting was taking root deep inside my psyche. I closed my eyes, and the memories they had weaponized against me began to replay in my mind, vivid and terrifying. 6 months ago, the fog had started creeping in. I remembered standing at the head of a massive conference table, preparing to introduce a lead investor I had known for over a decade. I opened my mouth, and his name simply vanished. It was a blank, terrifying void. I had stood there stammering for what felt like an eternity, before Spencer smoothly stepped in to rescue the moment. Then came the anger. I have always been a demanding leader, but I was never cruel. Yet 2 months ago, I had thrown a glass paperweight at a junior analyst for a minor typo on a zoning permit. I remembered the shock on the young man's face, the hushed whispers of my staff. I had felt completely out of control, a passenger in a vehicle, hijacked by an aggressive stranger. And the dizzy spells, the sudden paralyzing vertigo that would hit me late in the evenings, forcing me to grip the banister of my staircase just to remain upright. Had I truly broken that vase in the hallway last week? I remembered the shattered porcelain on the floor, and Vivienne cowering against the wall, weeping, telling me I had violently swept it off the console table in a fit of blind rage. I had no memory of doing it, but the broken pieces were right there. The fear paralyzed me. I pressed my palms against my temples, trying to physically hold my fracturing mind together. What if they were right? What if the brilliant, razor-sharp intellect that had built an empire was actually rotting away? What if I truly was a danger to the people I loved? The thought of hurting Elsie, my sweet, innocent 10-year-old girl, made me physically nauseous. If my mind was truly gone, perhaps I deserved this sterile beige box. Perhaps Spencer and Vivienne really were protecting me from myself. The isolation amplified every doubt, turning my hotel room into an echo chamber of my own worst fears. Suddenly, the sharp ring of the hotel room telephone shattered the silence. I jumped, my heart hammering against my ribs. I stared at the phone on the nightstand for a long time. It rang 3, 4, 5 times. My trembling hand reached out and lifted the receiver. "Hello?" I rasped, my voice sounding weak and thin. "Garrett, darling." It was Vivienne. Her voice was not the cold, hollow whisper from the courtroom, nor the impatient snap she had used when yanking the curtain shut on Elsie. It was her softest, most loving tone. It was the voice of the woman I had married, dripping with sorrow and profound emotional exhaustion. "Garrett, I am so sorry. I am so incredibly sorry. It had to happen this way. Are you okay? Did you get settled in the room?" I gripped the plastic receiver tightly. "You locked me out, Vivienne. You threw my life onto the driveway. How could you do this to me?" I heard a ragged, wet sniffle on the other end of the line. She was crying. It sounded so agonizingly genuine. "You left me no choice, darling," she whispered, her voice breaking perfectly on the final word. "I cry myself to sleep every single night, watching you deteriorate. It is breaking my heart to see the man I love fade away. But you have become so aggressive, Garrett. You do not remember the things you do, but they are terrifying. I have to protect Elsie. You know I have to protect her. You were screaming last week. You threw things. The house is simply not safe for a child when you are having your episodes." Her words were like venom coated in honey, slipping directly into my deepest insecurities. I closed my eyes, a single tear escaping. "I do not want to hurt anyone," I whispered, my spirit fracturing. "I know you do not," she replied gently. "That is why you need to let us help you. Spencer is sending over temporary conservatorship papers tomorrow morning. It is just a formality, Garrett. It will allow us to pay your medical bills, manage the company while you rest, and get you the specialized clinical care you desperately need right now. Please, just sign the papers. Do it for Elsie. Give yourself peace." The line went dead with a soft click. I slowly lowered the receiver back onto the cradle. The silence of the beige room returned, heavier than before. I stood up and walked over to the large mirror hanging above the dresser. I stared at the reflection staring back at me. I saw an old, tired man with dark circles under his eyes, gray skin, and trembling hands. I looked exactly like the broken, senile burden she described. The fight drained out of me completely. I lowered my head, defeated. The weight of 40 years collapsed onto my shoulders. I had no strength left to fight the people I once swore to protect. I was ready to sign it away. A sharp, authoritative knock at the door broke the heavy silence of the hotel room. I did not move at first. I just stared at the beige wood of the door, dreading whoever was on the other side. The knock came again, louder this time. I pushed myself up from the edge of the bed, my knees popping, the tremor in my right hand pulsing against my thigh, as I walked over and pulled the handle. Spencer stood in the hallway. He was dressed in a sharp charcoal gray suit, looking every bit the ruthless corporate executive I had trained him to be. Tucked under his left arm was a thick leather portfolio. His face immediately contorted into a mask of deep, agonizing pity the moment he saw me. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, closing the door behind him with a soft click. "Dad," he said, his voice hushed and incredibly gentle. "Look at you. You look exhausted. Have you been sleeping at all?" I did not answer. I just walked back to the small glass dining table in the corner of the room and sat down heavily. Spencer pulled up the opposite chair. He placed the thick leather portfolio on the glass surface and unzipped it. "I am sorry to bother you with company business right now," he said, his eyes conveying a practiced, mournful sympathy. "I know you need to rest, and Mom said you are having a very rough day. But the firm cannot stop turning. We have routine payroll approvals and a few quarter-end vendor contracts that the banks require the founding partner to authorize. It is just administrative red tape." I tried to focus on the papers he was pulling from the portfolio. My vision swam. The black ink on the stark white pages looked like a swarm of insects moving across the paper. I blinked hard, trying to force the text into focus, but a dull, throbbing ache began to pulse at the base of my skull. Spencer slid a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen across the glass table toward me. "Just sign where the yellow tabs are, Dad. I will handle the rest. You do not need to stress your mind with the details right now. Just let me steer the ship while you recover." I reached out to take the pen. My fingers shook so violently that the gold barrel clattered against the glass table before I could secure a grip. I stared at my own hand as if it belonged to a complete stranger. It was a pathetic, broken thing. As I looked at my trembling fingers, a sudden, vivid memory ripped through the fog in my mind. It was 35 years ago. I was standing on a frozen, muddy lot on the east side of Detroit. It was 5 in the morning, and the wind chill was 20 below zero. The general contractor had failed to show up, and the cement trucks were already pouring. I did not have a suit back then. I wore a heavy canvas jacket and thick work boots. I remembered grabbing a shovel and stepping right into the freezing sludge. I remembered the burning ache in my muscles, the raw blisters forming on my palms as I leveled the concrete with my own bare hands. I built my very first commercial warehouse with blood, sweat, and calloused fingers that never trembled. I was a man of iron and earth. I had clawed my way out of poverty to build an empire that stretched across the city skyline, and now, 35 years later, sitting in a sterile hotel room, I could not even pick up a pen. The contrast was a physical agony. It was the ultimate humiliation. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing the memory away. willing the strength to return to my body. I finally managed to grip the cold metal of the pen. Spencer stood up from his chair and walked around to my side of the table. He leaned over, placing a comforting, heavy hand on my left shoulder. "Take your time, Dad," he murmured softly. "There is no rush. We are here for you. We just want you to get better." As he leaned over me to point at the first yellow signature tab, his suit sleeve pulled back slightly. The cuff of his crisp white shirt slid up his wrist. My eyes caught a flash of metallic blue and silver. I stopped breathing. Wrapped around Spencer's wrist was a watch. But it was not just any watch. I have spent my entire life in rooms with billionaires, foreign investors, and banking magnates. I know wealth when I see it. It was a Patek Philippe Grand Complication, specifically the celestial model, with a dark blue dial mapping the stars. It was a masterpiece of horology that retailed for no less than $500,000. And it was not a fake. The intricate, flawless movement of the tourbillon inside the sapphire casing was unmistakable. I stared at the timepiece, my mind suddenly cutting through the heavy, drug-like fog that had been clouding my thoughts. The math was immediate and undeniable. Spencer was my chief financial officer. I paid him a very generous, very comfortable salary of $350,000 a year. Even with his annual bonuses, even with a flawless investment portfolio, there was absolutely no legitimate universe where Spencer could afford to casually wear a $500,000 watch on a Tuesday afternoon. He was wearing more than his entire yearly salary on his left wrist. The contradiction hit me like a bucket of freezing water. The comforting tone, the sympathetic eyes, the narrative that I was losing my mind. It all clashed violently against the obscene, unexplained wealth ticking away inches from my face. A spark of pure suspicion ignited in my mind. This was not dementia. This was not biological decline. I looked down at the papers he claimed were routine authorizations. The words were still blurry, but the gut feeling was sharp and screaming. I did not pull my arm away. I did not look up at his face. I kept my eyes on the paper, letting my hand shake violently as I pressed the pen to the signature line. I dragged the ink across the page, leaving a pathetic scrawl that barely resembled my name. I did it over and over again, signing every single yellow tab with the sloppy strokes of a dying man. I played the part he needed to see. "There you go, Dad," Spencer whispered, carefully pulling the documents away and slipping them back into his portfolio. "You did great. Go lie down. I will check on you tomorrow." He patted my shoulder one last time and walked toward the door. I sat frozen at the glass table, listening to the door closing behind him. A few seconds later, echoing faintly through the thin walls of the hotel hallway, I heard Spencer whistling. It was a cheerful tune, the sound of a man who had just won the lottery. I looked at my trembling hands, my heart turning to solid ice. 2 days passed before the family court granted a supervised visitation. My lawyers fought hard to secure 60 minutes in a public park. I arrived at Belle Isle Park a full hour early. The Detroit wind was biting, but I barely felt the cold. I sat on a wooden bench near the designated playground, my eyes fixed on the entrance path. Finally, a sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb. My heart leaped into my throat as the rear door opened. Out stepped a court-appointed social worker, followed closely by Vivian. And then there was Elsie, my beautiful, brilliant little girl. She was wearing the yellow wool coat I had bought for her last Christmas. But she looked so much smaller than I remembered. She walked with her head bowed, her hands shoved deep into her pockets. Vivienne walked 2 steps behind her, her posture rigid, her eyes scanning the park until they locked onto me. The animosity radiating from my wife was palpable. The social worker approached me, introducing herself with a brief professional nod, and outlined the strict rules of the visit. I was not to discuss the divorce. I was not to ask about her living situation. I was only there to provide a standard, normalized parental interaction. I agreed, my voice steady, though every instinct demanded I snatch my daughter and run. Vivian stood exactly 10 feet away, leaning against the wrought iron fence of the playground. She crossed her arms over her chest, wearing a pair of dark sunglasses that shielded her expression, but I could feel her watching us like a hawk. Every movement I made was being scrutinized. I knelt down as Elsie approached. I offered a warm, reassuring smile, trying to mask the overwhelming despair tearing at my insides. "Hi, sweetheart," I said softly. "I missed you so much." Elsie stopped a few feet away. She did not run into my arms like she usually did. She did not offer her bright, gap-toothed smile. She just stood there, her small shoulders tense, her eyes darting nervously toward Vivian before briefly glancing at me. "Hi, Dad," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. The unnatural silence between us was agonizing. This was a child who used to spend hours in my study, chattering endlessly about her science projects and her watercolor paintings, while I reviewed architectural blueprints. Now she looked like a prisoner, terrified of saying the wrong word. I guided her toward a nearby picnic table, sitting across from her. I tried to bridge the gap. I asked her about her fourth-grade teacher. I asked if she was still reading the fantasy novels we had bought together at the bookstore downtown. She answered in single syllables. Yes, no. It is okay. She kept her hands folded tightly in her lap, picking at her cuticles until they were raw. I reached out and gently placed my hand over hers to stop the nervous picking. The moment my skin touched hers, she flinched. It was a subtle, heartbreaking movement, but I felt it. I looked into her eyes. They were swimming with unshed tears. She was trying so hard to be brave, trying to navigate a nightmare she did not understand. I leaned in a little closer, keeping my voice light and conversational, for the benefit of the social worker taking notes nearby. "You know I love you, right?" I asked her. "No matter what is happening right now, you are the most important thing in the world to me." Elsie nodded slowly. A single tear escaped, rolling down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away with the sleeve of her yellow coat, throwing another panicked glance over her shoulder at Vivian. The hour evaporated faster than I could have ever imagined. The social worker stepped forward, checking her watch. "That is all the time we have for today, Mr. Whitlock," she announced in a polite but firm tone. "It is time to say goodbye." The words felt like a physical blow. I stood up, my knees aching. I tried to maintain a composed exterior, knowing that any display of excessive emotion would immediately be documented and weaponized by Vivian in the upcoming custody hearings. I looked down at Elsie. "I will see you soon, sweetheart," I promised, trying to inject a confidence into my voice that I did not truly feel. "I will never stop fighting for you." Elsie stood paralyzed for a second. Then, breaking the invisible barrier of fear that had held her captive for the entire hour, she lunged forward. She threw her arms around my waist, burying her face into my overcoat. I dropped to my knees on the cold pavement and wrapped my arms tightly around her small frame. Holding my daughter again was overwhelming. I closed my eyes, breathing in the scent of her shampoo, but in that brief second of embrace, while my body shielded her entirely from Vivian's line of sight, I felt a sudden, deliberate movement. Elsie's tiny hand slipped down my side and jammed roughly into the right pocket of my jacket. She pushed something deep into the fabric, The movement was so quick, so desperate, that if I had not been hyper-aware of her every breath, I might have missed it entirely. Before I could process what had just happened, a sharp voice cut through the air. "That is enough, Garrett." Vivian marched over, her heels clicking aggressively against the concrete. She reached down and snatched Elsie by the hand, physically peeling my daughter away from me. Elsie did not resist. She let her mother drag her backward, her head bowed in submission. The social worker stepped between us, acting as a human shield, ensuring the separation was complete. I remained kneeling on the cold ground, watching as Vivian led my daughter back to the black SUV. The vehicle doors slammed shut, the engine roared to life, and they drove away, leaving me alone in the freezing park. I stood up slowly. The wind bit right through my clothes, but a completely different kind of chill was rapidly spreading through my veins. My right hand hovered over my jacket pocket. I could feel the faint outline of whatever she had secretly slipped inside, a small, textured lump pressing against the silk lining. I did not dare pull it out in the open. The park was incredibly public, and I knew Vivian was meticulous enough to have someone watching me. I turned around and walked briskly toward the public restrooms near the recreational center. The concrete building was damp and smelled of harsh chemical cleaners. I walked past the rusted sinks, entered the last stall, and slid the heavy metal lock into place. The silence of the tiled room was broken only by the sound of my own shallow breathing. My hands were shaking again, but this time it was not from the alleged illness. It was pure adrenaline rushing through my system. I reached deep into my pocket and pulled out the small object. It was a tiny, crumpled piece of lined notebook paper, torn hastily from a spiral binder. I flattened it out carefully against the top of the toilet paper dispenser, smoothing the deep creases with my thumb. Written in pencil, in Elsie's jagged, terrified handwriting, were 7 words that completely altered my reality. "Daddy, do not drink the orange juice." Those 7 words hit my chest with the physical force of a sledgehammer. I stood in the harsh fluorescent light of the public restroom, staring at the jagged pencil marks until the letters began to blur. My breath hitched, trapping itself in my throat, as a profound, chilling silence settled over my mind. For months I had been drowning in a sea of manufactured confusion, second-guessing my own sanity, accepting the terrifying narrative that my brilliant mind was slowly decaying. But Elsie, my observant 10-year-old girl, had just handed me the key to my own prison. I leaned back against the cold tile wall, clutching the crumpled paper. The gut feeling, that primal instinct that had kept me alive and thriving in the ruthless world of commercial real estate for 4 decades, suddenly roared back to life. It was a visceral awakening. I closed my eyes and allowed my mind to meticulously trace back the timeline of my alleged dementia. I needed to find the exact moment the rot had truly begun to take hold of my life. 6 months ago. The realization hit me like a spark igniting gasoline. 6 months ago, my health was impeccable. I was running 3 miles a day, managing complex acquisitions, and outsmarting men half my age. It was exactly 6 months ago that Vivian returned from a supposed wellness retreat in Oshai with a new health regimen. She told me she was worried about my heart. She consulted a naturopathic cardiologist who recommended a custom-blended liquid supplement. I waved it off initially, telling her my doctors were perfectly happy with my standard vitamins. But Vivian persisted. She used her softest voice, her loving touches, crying softly as she begged me to take it for her peace of mind. She simply could not ever bear losing me to a sudden heart attack. Like an absolute, trusting fool, I relented without asking any further questions. The daily routine quickly became an absolute, unbending ritual in our home. Every single night, exactly 1 hour before bed, Vivian brought me a crystal glass of freshly squeezed orange juice. The supplement was supposedly bitter, so she insisted on mixing it into the juice herself to mask the taste. I remembered how she would carry it into my study on a silver tray, placing it gently on my desk. She would stand there watching me with a loving smile, refusing to leave the room until I drank every drop. If I left even a quarter of it, she would pout and hand it back, reminding me of her anxiety. I genuinely never thought twice about it at the time. I truly saw it as the ultimate gesture of a devoted wife, caring for her aging husband. I never noticed the slight chalky residue down at the very bottom of the glass. I never questioned why she strictly forbade the housekeeping staff from preparing my evening beverage. The isolation of that nightly ritual was not an act of love. It was the careful, calculated administration of poison. With absolute, undeniable clarity, I began to meticulously cross-reference my symptoms against the nightly timeline of the orange juice. The pattern was so incredibly clear and obvious that I felt a surge of nausea for not recognizing it sooner. The heavy, suffocating brain fog absolutely never struck me in the middle of the afternoon. It always began to roll in late at night, shortly after I finished the juice. By midnight, I would feel detached from reality, my words slurring, my balance completely compromised. The memory lapses they used as ammunition against me invariably happened during those midnight hours, or in the early mornings, before the chemical cocktail had fully processed through my system. The aggressive outbursts, the broken vases in the hallway, they were not real dementia. They were toxic reactions, neurological misfires, caused by whatever sedatives she was pouring down my throat. I slowly opened my heavy eyes and looked straight down at my bare hands. I held them out flat in front of me, fingers splayed wide against the harsh light of the restroom. For the past 3 days, ever since they had locked me out of the estate and banished me to that sterile hotel, I had been drinking nothing but bottled water and bitter black coffee. I had not consumed a single drop of Vivian's poisonous nightly orange juice. I stared at my hands with bated breath, watching for the familiar, humiliating tremor that had plagued me for months. They were completely steady, not a single shake, not a single twitch. The mechanical, rhythmic spasm that made me drop my pen in front of Spencer was rapidly fading away into nothing. The withdrawal of the poison was already working. My central nervous system was slowly healing and repairing itself. I rotated my wrists, clenching my fingers into tight, powerful fists. The physical strength I thought had abandoned me forever was still there, dormant, but entirely intact. A wave of profound relief washed over me immediately, followed by a rage so deep and cold, it felt like liquid nitrogen pumping through my veins. I was not dying. My brain was not rotting. I was not losing my mind. I was the victim of a meticulous, highly orchestrated chemical assassination. Vivian and Spencer had secretly conspired together to slowly destroy my cognitive functions, to render me a completely helpless and dependent invalid, all so they could silently execute a massive coup and seize my empire without raising a single red flag. They used my trust, my love, and my age as weapons to disarm me. They convinced my board of directors, my friends, and even my own mind that I was a broken old man. But they made one fatal, arrogant miscalculation. They locked me out of the house before the job was completely finished. By banishing me to that hotel, they inadvertently cut off my supply of the poison. They had given me the one thing I needed to connect the dots. They had finally given me the gift of clarity. I walked over to the rusted sink and splashed freezing cold water onto my face. I scrubbed my cheeks, washing away the pathetic, defeated old man who had sat crying in the park just 10 minutes prior. I looked into the cracked mirror, locking eyes with my own reflection. The gray, lifeless complexion was already giving way to a sharp, predatory focus. The fog was lifting piece by piece, and the brilliant, ruthless real estate magnate who had conquered all of Detroit was waking up from a 6-month chemical coma. I dried my face with a rough paper towel and carefully folded Elsie's note, tucking it securely into my breast pocket, right next to my heart. My daughter had risked everything to save my life. Now it was my turn to save hers. I stepped out of the public restroom, the biting winter wind no longer affecting me at all. I now knew exactly what I had to do next. I desperately needed absolute proof. I needed trusted allies. And I needed to strike back from the shadows before they even knew I was awake. I stood in that public restroom for a long time, staring at the jagged pencil marks until the letters burned themselves into my retinas. The sheer terror radiating from my 10-year-old daughter's handwriting was a physical blow to my chest, driving the remaining breath from my lungs. The gut feeling, that primal instinct that had kept me alive and thriving in the ruthless world of commercial real estate for 4 decades, now took absolute, uncompromising control of my mind. I folded the tiny scrap of paper, slipping it deep into my breast pocket, next to my heart, and walked out into the biting Detroit wind. I did not look back toward the street where the black SUV had disappeared. I just walked, my pace quickening with every block, the chilling winter air rushing over my face and clearing the last lingering traces of the chemical fog from my brain. I made it back to the sterile hotel room just as the sun began to dip below the city skyline, casting long gray shadows across the beige walls. I did not turn on the overhead lights. I sat on the edge of the stiff bed and meticulously mapped out the timeline of my supposed dementia. It was a terrifyingly simple equation. 6 months ago, Vivian had insisted I start taking a new liquid heart supplement, mixed every single night into a glass of fresh orange juice. She never let the housekeeping staff prepare it. She meticulously did it herself, standing over my desk and watching me swallow every drop. I realized with absolute, horrifying clarity that my brain fog, my sudden tremors, and my aggressive memory lapses only ever happened late at night and into the early hours of the morning, right after I consumed her toxic concoction. I had not had a single drop of her orange juice since being kicked out of my own house 3 days ago. I held my hands out in front of me in the dim light of the hotel room. The tremors were completely fading. The fog was lifting from my mind like a heavy curtain being pulled back. I was not dying of early-onset dementia. I was being chemically destroyed by the woman I loved. The realization did not break me. It forged me into something cold and incredibly dangerous. I waited in the dark, watching the digital clock on the nightstand slowly tick forward. Midnight passed, then 1 o'clock in the morning. I needed to be absolutely certain that Spencer and Vivian were deeply asleep in my estate before I made my next move. Fully lucid and burning with a cold, calculated rage, I opened my laptop at exactly 2 in the morning. The glow of the screen illuminated the dark room. When I appointed Spencer as the chief financial officer of Whitlock Development 5 years ago, I had handed him the keys to the kingdom. But I am not a foolish man. I built my empire in a ruthless city, where loyalty is often rented, not owned. I had secretly kept a hidden, read-only backdoor access to the company's master ledgers. It was a digital safety net from my early days, a ghost protocol known only to me, and a retired software architect who owed me his life. I typed in the complex sequence of proxy addresses and passwords, bypassing the modern security gates Spencer had undoubtedly erected. The system recognized my ghost credentials and granted me silent, invisible entry into the financial heart of my company. The conflict immediately shifted from the physical world into the digital realm. I bypassed the standard executive dashboards and dove straight into the raw, unfiltered transaction logs. My fingers flew across the keyboard with a speed and precision I had not felt in half a year. The chemical cobwebs were gone. I was back in my element, operating behind enemy lines. My first target was the heavy, gold-plated fountain pen. I needed to trace the exact documents Spencer had brought to my hotel room just hours ago, the papers he so gently coerced me into signing while wearing a $500,000 watch. He had claimed they were routine payroll approvals and quarter-end vendor contracts that required the founding partner's authorization. I pulled up the signature authorization queue for the day. There they were, 5 heavily encrypted files bearing my sloppy, chemically induced signature. I cracked open the digital seal on the first document and began to read. They were not payroll authorizations. They were not vendor approvals. My blood ran cold as I scanned the dense legal jargon. They were irrevocable authorizations for massive, untraceable wire transfers. Spencer was moving astronomical sums of money out of the primary corporate holding accounts and funneling them directly into a series of obscure shell limited liability companies registered in Nevada. I pulled up the ledger details. $4 million transferred to Meridian Strategic Solutions. $6 million routed to Ironvale Global Management. Another $5 million diverted to Ridgeline Advisory Group. All of it categorized under the vague, unassailable guise of emergency legal and consulting fees. I cross-referenced the corporate registry for these Nevada entities. The trail was heavily obfuscated through layers of blind trusts and proxy directors, but the underlying structure was identical. They were all phantom companies, created exactly 6 months ago, right around the time Vivian introduced my nightly glass of orange juice. Spencer was not simply preparing to take over the company. He was actively, systematically draining the operating capital. He was bleeding Whitlock Development dry, siphoning off the lifeblood of my life's work, while keeping me heavily sedated and confused. I sat back in the chair, the blue light of the screen reflecting in my eyes. The sheer scale of the embezzlement was breathtaking. If these transfers continued at this pace, the company would be completely insolvent within 3 months. And when the board of directors finally discovered the missing millions, they would follow the digital paper trail straight back to the authorization forms. They would find my signature on every single catastrophic transfer. Spencer had engineered the perfect crime. He was stealing my empire, and he was framing a dementia-riddled old man to take the absolute entirety of the legal fall. If the authorities came knocking, Spencer would simply play the role of the devastated son, handing over the ledgers and shaking his head at his father's tragic cognitive decline. I felt a surge of adrenaline so powerful it made my teeth ache. The urge to pick up the phone, to call the police, to scream and shout, and demand their immediate arrest was nearly overwhelming. I wanted to storm the gates of my estate and drag them both out into the street, but I forced myself to stop. I took a deep breath, carefully analyzing the entire board like a grandmaster studying a hostile chess match. If I confronted them right now, They would effortlessly flip the narrative. Vivienne would claim my accusations were just terrifying symptoms of dementia. Spencer would instantly freeze my access. I realized I could not just fight back. I had to silently set one absolutely inescapable legal trap. The opportunity to deploy that trap arrived less than 48 hours later. A courier knocked on my hotel room door, delivering a formal summons for a mandatory mediation session. It was the first legal step in their aggressive campaign to secure a permanent conservatorship and assume total control over Whitlock development. I stared at the heavy cream cardstock, feeling a grim sense of satisfaction. They were moving incredibly fast, eager to legally bind me before I had any chance to seek outside counsel. They wanted to corner me, while they believed my mind was still crumbling into dust. I decided to give them exactly what they wanted to see. I spent the morning preparing for the performance of a lifetime. I deliberately slept poorly, allowing dark circles to deepen into bruised shadows. I wore a wrinkled suit, the tie knotted off-center. I needed to look like a man losing his grip on daily life. When I walked into the downtown conference room of their legal firm, the atmosphere was thick with calculated tension. Vivienne sat at the far end of the mahogany table, flanked by two aggressive attorneys. She wore a modest black dress, playing the role of the tragic, long-suffering wife to absolute perfection. Spencer sat to her right, his posture relaxed, exuding an air of quiet victory. He had the decency to leave the $500,000 watch at home today, opting for a modest leather band. The deception was suffocating. I took my seat slowly, making sure to let my hands tremble as I pulled the heavy chair away from the table. I kept my gaze down, staring blankly at the wood grain, avoiding direct eye contact with anyone. The lead attorney began to outline the proposed terms. He used soft, condescending tones, explaining that the conservatorship was entirely for my own protection. He listed the alleged incidents of my cognitive failure, the aggressive outbursts, the memory lapses, and the physical decline. He presented a staggering buyout agreement for my shares, a number so insultingly low it was practically theft, framed as a generous allowance to cover my medical care. I let him speak uninterrupted for 20 minutes, forcing my breathing to remain shallow and erratic. When he finally slid the thick stack of preliminary agreements across the table toward me, I knew it was time to commit to the act. I reached out with a violently shaking right hand. I allowed my fingers to graze the edge of the paper, and then I knocked the silver pen completely off the table. It clattered loudly onto the hardwood floor. The room fell dead silent. I looked down at my empty hands, letting my lower lip quiver. "I am sorry," I whispered, slurring the words together to sound confused and overwhelmed. "I cannot seem to hold it right now. My head hurts so badly today." I looked up, letting my eyes wander aimlessly before settling on Vivienne. "I just feel so tired. I just want to rest. I do not understand all these numbers." Vivienne instantly raised her hand to her mouth, stifling a manufactured sob. She looked at her attorney with a perfectly calibrated expression of heartbreak. "Oh, Garrett," she murmured, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "We know you are tired. We are doing this so you can rest. You do not have to worry about the numbers anymore." Spencer leaned forward, clasping his hands. "It is okay, Dad. We can adjourn for today. Just give us your verbal agreement that you accept the framework, and we can handle the physical signatures when you are having a better day. We just need to know you are on board." I let my head loll forward slightly, staring at the blank documents. "I understand," I mumbled softly, letting a defeated sigh escape my lungs. "If this is what the doctors think is best, If this will keep Elsie safe, I agree to consider the terms. I just need to lie down. The visible wave of relief that washed over the opposing side of the table was nauseating. Spencer and Vivian exchanged a microscopic, triumphant glance. They had successfully broken the Great Garrett Whitlock. They believed I was a hollow shell, ready to surrender without a single fight. They adjourned the session immediately, their lawyers packing up the files with barely concealed smirks. The moment I stepped out of the heavy glass doors and into the crisp afternoon air, the pathetic, trembling old man completely vanished. My posture straightened. My hands were rock solid. The fog of the mediation room evaporated, replaced by a crystalline, predatory focus. I did not return to the hotel. Instead, I walked 3 blocks south to a private garage where I had rented an unassuming sedan using a prepaid debit card earlier that morning. I slipped into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and pulled out onto the busy streets. I merged onto the interstate, leaving Detroit in my rearview mirror. I drove for 3 straight hours, pushing the car across state lines into Ohio. I needed to put as much physical and legal distance between myself and Vivian's network as possible. She was deeply embedded in the local medical community. If I went to a nearby hospital, the results would inevitably be leaked or altered by one of her well-paid associates. I could not risk a single error. I navigated the highway in total silence, calculating the exact chemical half-life of whatever she had been feeding me. I needed indisputable scientific evidence, a weapon no attorney could ever dismantle. Just before sunset, I pulled into the quiet parking lot of a private, independent toxicology clinic, located in a generic suburban medical park. It was a facility specializing in heavy metal testing, obscure chemical dependencies, and corporate evaluations. I walked through the glass doors and approached the front desk. I paid entirely in cash, using a fabricated name and an untraceable mailing address I had secured years ago. The receptionist handed me intake forms, asking no questions about my out-of-state license plate or my demand for complete anonymity. I sat in the sterile waiting room, filling out the paperwork, requesting the most comprehensive chemical panel the clinic offered. I ordered tests for heavy sedatives, neurotoxins, and synthetic compounds mimicking symptoms of decay. When the nurse called my false name, I followed her into the bright examination room. She wrapped the tourniquet around my bicep and tapped my vein. I watched the dark red blood fill the plastic vials, feeling profound vindication with every drop. This was the absolute proof of their betrayal. After the blood draw, the clinician snipped a cluster of hair from the base of my scalp, securing the follicles in a sealed plastic bag. The hair test was the ultimate insurance policy. While blood might only show traces from recent days, the hair would provide a precise historical timeline. It would show the exact day the poison was first introduced, cementing Vivian's nightly orange juice ritual into an irrefutable timeline of systemic abuse. I signed the final chain of custody documents with a perfectly steady signature, leaving the private clinic armed with the absolute truth. The drive from the clinic took me far away from the polished glass and steel of the financial district. I navigated the rental car through the decaying industrial outskirts of the city, where the streetlights flickered and the roads were cracked. I pulled into the gravel lot of a run-down 24-hour diner. It was the kind of place that smelled of stale coffee, old grease, and forgotten dreams. Neon tubes buzzed above the entrance, casting a sickly red glow over the cracked pavement. This was exactly the kind of invisible, forgotten corner of the world I needed right now. I pushed open the heavy glass door, the small bell chiming weakly above me. The diner was mostly empty, save for a tired waitress wiping down the counter and a lone figure sitting in the back booth. I walked past the empty vinyl seats and slid into the booth across from him. Gideon Vance did not look up immediately. He continued to slowly stir his black coffee. Gideon was my original corporate attorney 40 years ago, when I was just a hungry contractor pouring concrete and hustling for permits. Gideon was the ruthless legal architect who helped me incorporate Whitlock Development. He was a man who understood that in this city, the law was not a shield, but a weapon. Spencer and Vivian believed Gideon had retired a decade ago to a golf course in Arizona. They believed my current legal team, the very people they had already compromised, were the only counsel I had left. They were wrong. Gideon had never truly retired. He had simply retreated into the shadows, maintaining a quiet, lucrative private practice for a select few clients who valued absolute discretion. He looked up at me, his pale blue eyes just as piercing and unforgiving as they had been 40 years ago. He took one look at my face and set his spoon down. "You look like hell, Garrett," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp. I poured myself a glass of water from the plastic pitcher on the table. "I feel like hell, Gideon, but my mind has never been clearer." I reached into my inner jacket pocket and pulled out the folded stack of financial printouts I had secured during my late-night digital raid on the company ledgers. I smoothed the papers flat against the sticky laminate of the diner table and slid them across to him. Gideon pulled a pair of reading glasses from his breast pocket and began to review the documents. For 10 minutes, the only sound in our booth was the rustle of paper and the distant hum of the diner refrigerator. I watched his expression shift from casual curiosity to a cold, hardened professional fury. He traced a weathered finger over the wire transfer logs, his eyes narrowing at the Nevada shell entities Spencer had created. "They are bleeding you out," Gideon murmured, not looking up from the page. "6 million here, 5 million there. It is a systematic, highly sophisticated embezzlement operation under the guise of emergency consulting fees. And the signatures authorizing these transfers? They are mine," I replied, my voice devoid of emotion. "But I did not sign them willingly. I am being chemically poisoned, Gideon. They have been feeding me heavy sedatives and neurotoxins for 6 months to mimic early-onset dementia. They waited until my mind was entirely compromised, locked me in a hotel room, and handed me a pen. I have just come from an independent toxicology clinic. I have the blood and hair samples secured. In a week, I will have the indisputable scientific proof of their assassination attempt." Gideon slowly took off his glasses and placed them on the table. He leaned back in the vinyl booth, staring at me with a profound, terrifying respect. "You do not want a defense attorney, Garrett. You want an executioner." I nodded slowly. "I want to build a legal guillotine, and I want them to pull the lever themselves." Gideon did not hesitate. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a fresh yellow legal pad. "We are not going to simply block their moves," he said, his pen hovering over the paper. "We are going to completely obliterate their playing field. If we confront them now with just suspicions and partial evidence, they will immediately file for an emergency psychiatric hold. They will use your medical records, heavily curated by Vivian, to prove you are suffering from severe paranoia. We have to operate entirely in the dark. First, we secure the remaining capital. I am going to quietly draft an irrevocable trust tonight. I will transfer your entire remaining personal fortune, every piece of property, every single untouched stock portfolio, directly into this trust. You will be the sole beneficiary, but I will be the designated trustee. The moment Spencer tries to access your personal accounts to finalize his coup, he will hit a solid, impenetrable brick wall. The money will simply no longer exist in your name. They will be locked out of the vault entirely. I felt a grim smile pull at the corners of my mouth. And the company ledgers? I asked. Spencer is still draining the corporate operating accounts. If he realizes the personal funds are gone, he will accelerate the embezzlement to take whatever cash is left in the business. Gideon offered a dark, humorless chuckle. Let him try. I still have contacts deep inside the Federal Banking Commission. Men who owe me favors from the old days. I am going to file a highly classified emergency alert regarding these specific Nevada wire transfers. I will flag the shell companies for suspected money laundering and corporate fraud. The commission will instantly place a covert tracking monitor on every single account associated with Spencer. He will think he is moving millions of dollars in total secrecy. In reality, he will be feeding a direct live stream of evidence straight into a federal investigation. The beauty of the trap was its absolute invisibility. Spencer and Vivienne would continue their ruthless campaign, completely unaware that the ground beneath them had already been hollowed out. Every fake document Spencer filed, every stolen dollar he wired, would simply add another decade to his inevitable prison sentence. And what do I do now? I asked, sliding the empty water glass away from the center of the table. Gideon leaned forward slightly and looked me dead in the eye. You go back to that hotel. You drink your black coffee. You stay entirely away from Vivienne. And above all else, you play the part. You act like the broken, senile, dying old man they desperately need you to be. You stumble, you slur your words, and you let them feel incredibly powerful. You make them feel like absolute gods, Garrett, because the higher they climb on their pedestal of arrogance, the harder they are going to fall when we finally pull the floor out from under them. I nodded silently, taking a deep breath, and slowly stood up from the vinyl booth. I buttoned my coat, turned around, and walked out into the freezing night, ready to play my final role. I left the diner and immediately drove to a secluded payphone on the edge of the industrial district. Gideon had handed me a sealed envelope before we parted, containing a single name and a burner number. The man on the other end answered on the first ring. His name was Roan, a former intelligence operative who now traded his specialized military skill set for exorbitant corporate bounties. I did not need a standard private investigator who took photographs from parked cars. I needed a ghost. We met an hour later in the subterranean parking garage of a deserted shopping center. Roan was a shadow of a man, built like a vault door, with eyes that betrayed absolutely zero emotion. I handed him a thick manila folder containing blueprints of the Whitlock Development corporate headquarters, the make and model of Spencer's vehicles, and $20,000 in untraceable cash. I gave him his primary directive. I told him to completely ignore my wife. Vivienne was a master architect of deception. She was meticulous, calculating, and far too paranoid to leave a digital footprint or speak carelessly in open spaces. Spencer, however, was entirely different. Spencer was intoxicated by his newfound power. He was an arrogant amateur, playing a billionaire's game, blinding himself with expensive watches and unearned authority. Arrogance always breeds carelessness. Roan nodded silently, taking the folder. He assured me that by tomorrow morning, my chief financial officer would be completely wired. He possessed military-grade audio surveillance equipment that could bypass standard corporate sweeps. He would plant microscopic transmitters inside the leather headliner of Spencer's luxury sports car and deep within the ventilation ducts of his executive suite. I drove back to my beige hotel room, my pulse thrumming with a dark, steady anticipation. The following days tested the absolute limits of my human endurance. Playing the part of a broken, senile old man in public was easy compared to the agonizing psychological warfare of sitting alone in that hotel suite. I paced the floorboards until my feet ached, my mind racing through 1,000 terrifying scenarios. Every time I looked at the digital clock on the bedside table, I felt a physical pain in my chest. I knew that with every passing hour, Spencer was wiring hundreds of thousands of dollars out of my corporate accounts. My life's work, the empire I had built with calloused hands and sleepless nights, was actively bleeding out. I had to force myself to stay away from the company ledgers. I could not risk Spencer noticing a ghost login while Gideon was setting the trap with the Federal Banking Commission. I had to let them steal from me. I had to sit in silence and watch the water rise, trusting the process. The sheer helplessness of the situation was a unique form of torture. I stared at the blank walls, listening to the monotonous hum of the air conditioning, feeling completely disconnected from the world I used to rule. My phone remained silent. I had strictly forbidden Gideon and Roan from contacting me on my primary line. I bought a cheap disposable cellular phone from a corner convenience store and left it sitting on the glass dining table, waiting for Roan to transmit the encrypted audio files. The quiet was deafening, but the financial bleeding was not the true source of my agony. Money could eventually be recovered. Companies could be rebuilt. The true nightmare that kept me awake all night was the terrifying, vivid image of my precious daughter. Elsie was trapped inside that sprawling estate with a monster. I pulled the crumpled piece of notebook paper from my jacket pocket, flattening it out against the glass table for the 100th time. "Daddy, do not drink the orange juice." Her jagged, terrified handwriting broke my heart every single time I looked at it. My brilliant 10-year-old girl had figured out the assassination attempt before I did. She had seen the truth hiding behind Vivian's loving smiles. Now she was alone behind enemy lines, surrounded by people who were actively trying to destroy her father. I imagined her sitting at the grand dining table, keeping her head down, eating her dinner, while Vivian and Spencer calmly discussed my mental decay. I wondered if Vivian was watching Elsie as closely as she had watched me in the park. Was my daughter safe? Was she hiding in her bedroom, waiting for me to rescue her? The thought of Vivian placing her manicured hands on my child filled me with a primal, violent rage. I wanted to tear the hotel door off its hinges, drive straight to the estate, and shatter the wrought iron gates with my bare hands. I wanted to storm the house and carry Elsie away from that toxic environment. But I knew that was exactly what Vivian wanted. If I showed up screaming and demanding my daughter, the police would be called. The temporary conservatorship would be finalized immediately. I would be locked away in a psychiatric ward, and Elsie would be completely at their mercy forever. I had to be a ghost. I had to be patient. I had to swallow my pride and my absolute fury, channeling every single ounce of my energy into the trap. I spent the third day sitting in complete darkness, staring at the disposable phone on the table. I rehearsed my performance for the next mediation session. I practiced my tremors, ensuring my hands shook with the exact biological rhythm of a failing nervous system. I practiced slurring my speech, dropping my gaze, becoming the empty shell they desperately needed me to be. It was a humiliating, degrading exercise, but it was the absolute armor I had to wear. By the fourth afternoon, the sheer weight of the isolation began to mess with my perception of time. The beige walls seemed to close in, the air growing thick and stale. I questioned if Roan had been caught while attempting to plant the devices inside the heavily guarded corporate headquarters. I wondered if Spencer's security team had routinely swept the sports car and discovered the tiny hidden audio transmitters before they could ever broadcast. Doubt is the absolute enemy of a well-laid plan, and my mind was a fertile breeding ground for paranoia. Just as the sun began to set, casting long gray shadows across the carpet, the disposable phone finally vibrated. The harsh buzz shattered the oppressive silence of the suite. I lunged forward, grabbing the plastic device with steady, powerful hands. The screen illuminated, displaying a single anonymous text message containing an encrypted web link and a complex sequence of alphanumeric passwords. Roan had breached the fortress. I booted up my laptop, my fingers flying across the keyboard with ruthless precision. I typed in the credentials, bypassing the security gateways, and downloaded the first batch of compressed audio files. I connected a pair of noise-canceling headphones, placed them over my ears, and pressed play. The crisp, clear sound of a luxury car engine roaring to life filled my head. The absolute agonizing wait was finally completely over. The brutal hunt for my family's ultimate salvation had officially begun today. I sat in the dim light of the hotel room, the noise-canceling headphones pressing tightly against my ears. For 3 agonizing days, I had listened to the covert audio feeds transmitting from Spencer's luxury sports car and his executive office. I heard the sneering arrogance in my stepson's voice as he authorized more fraudulent wire transfers, the casual cruelty as he and Vivian discussed my impending commitment to a psychiatric facility over the phone. But as infuriating as those recordings were, they were merely pieces of a financial puzzle. The true weapon, the absolute confirmation of their monstrous betrayal, was arriving today. The digital clock on the nightstand shifted to precisely 9 in the morning when a sharp, authoritative knock echoed through the quiet suite. I removed the headphones, my heart settling into a cold, steady rhythm. I walked to the door and opened it. A private courier stood in the hallway, his face entirely impassive. He handed me a thick, heavily sealed envelope bearing the discreet emblem of the Independent Toxicology Clinic in Ohio. I signed the electronic tablet with a hand that was now completely still, took the package, and closed the door. I walked over to the glass dining table, my sanctuary of truth in this beige prison. I did not tear the envelope open immediately. I simply placed my hands flat against the smooth surface of the paper, feeling the weight of the answers hidden inside. This was the precipice. Once I opened this seal, there was absolutely no turning back. The narrative of the confused, deteriorating old man would be dead forever, replaced by a reality far darker than any corporate coup. My disposable cellular phone began to vibrate violently against the glass, startling me. The caller identification displayed a restricted number. I picked up the device and pressed the green button, holding it to my ear. "Mr. Whitlock," a voice said. It was Dr. Halverson, the lead toxicologist I had met in Ohio. He did not offer any polite greetings or professional pleasantries. His tone was incredibly grave, carrying the heavy, grim weight of a man delivering a terminal diagnosis. "I have your results right in front of me," he continued, his voice lowering to a serious whisper. "I sent the physical copies via courier, but I felt a profound moral obligation to call you the absolute second the laboratory confirmed the final chemical breakdown." I looked down at the sealed envelope on the table. "Go ahead, doctor," I replied, my voice perfectly steady. "Give me the absolute truth." Dr. Halverson let out a long, heavy breath. "Mr. Whitlock, we ran an exhaustive analysis on the hair follicle samples you provided. Hair follicles are meticulous biological historians. They record every single substance introduced into the human body, laying down a chronological timeline of exposure. What we found in your samples is not a natural cognitive decline. It is not an autoimmune response. It is a highly deliberate, systemic chemical attack. The words hung in the air, confirming the terrifying intuition that Elsie had planted in my mind. "Please be specific," I demanded softly. "What exactly have they been putting inside my body?" I heard the rustling of paper on the other end of the line. "Your system is saturated with a highly sophisticated, escalating cocktail of toxins," Dr. Halverson explained. "First, we identified dangerous levels of thallium and arsenic. These are incredibly toxic heavy metals. Over a sustained period, they systematically destroy the central nervous system. They cause profound fatigue, severe muscular tremors, and a complete loss of physical coordination." "That explains the shaking hands," I murmured, recalling the humiliating moment I dropped the silver pen in the mediation room. "Yes," the doctor confirmed, "but the heavy metals were only the physical component. The psychological symptoms, the sudden memory loss, the aggressive outbursts, and the paralyzing brain fog, those were caused by a secondary compound. We found massive traces of a high-grade, off-market synthetic sedative. It is a chemical cousin to flunitrazepam, but it has been structurally altered to evade standard medical screenings. It suppresses the frontal lobe, obliterates short-term memory retention, and induces severe paranoia and emotional instability. It is a chemical straitjacket designed to completely fracture a human mind." I closed my eyes, picturing Vivienne standing in my study, smiling sweetly as she handed me that glass of freshly squeezed orange juice. She had watched me swallow arsenic and synthetic tranquilizers every single night, kissing my cheek while she slowly erased my existence. The sheer calculated evil of her routine was paralyzing. "How long?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. "How long have I been consuming this poison?" "The timeline in your hair follicles is absolutely pristine," Dr. Halverson replied. "The exposure began exactly 6 months ago. The heavy metal deposits start out very small, almost microscopic, and then they steadily increase in concentration, week after week. Whoever is administering this cocktail is incredibly patient and highly methodical. They have been slowly raising the dosage, carefully calibrating the toxins to simulate a naturally progressing degenerative brain disease without causing an immediate, suspicious medical emergency." I gripped the edge of the glass table. "And what would have happened if the dosage had continued?" I asked. The silence on the phone was chilling. Dr. Halverson cleared his throat. "Mr. Whitlock, based on the exponential curve of the heavy metal accumulation in your most recent hair growth, you were rapidly approaching a critical toxicity threshold. If you had continued ingesting this specific chemical cocktail for another 2 months, your central nervous system would have completely shut down. The heavy metals would have triggered massive cardiac arrest, stopping your heart entirely. And even if your heart had somehow survived the physical trauma, the synthetic sedatives were literally dissolving your neural pathways. Within 60 days, your brain would have been permanently, irreversibly damaged. You would have been trapped in a state of absolute, profound dementia for the rest of your life." The phone slipped slightly in my sweating palm. 2 months, 60 days. That was the precise margin between my current lucidity and a permanent, agonizing death. Vivienne and Spencer were not simply executing a hostile corporate takeover. They were not just stealing my money, my properties, and my legacy. They were actively, patiently murdering me. The stakes had just instantly elevated from a bitter civil divorce dispute to a calculated criminal homicide plot. "Thank you, doctor," I whispered into the phone. "You have saved my life." I ended the call and placed the disposable device down onto the table. I finally reached out and tore open the heavy envelope, pulling out the thick stack of laboratory reports. I stared at the dense rows of scientific data, the graphs charting my deliberate destruction. The betrayal was no longer just a theory or a desperate suspicion. It was medical fact. My wife and the boy I had raised as my own son were cold-blooded assassins. They had weaponized my love, slowly poisoning me in the comfort of my own home. I was no longer a victim. I was the architect of their absolute destruction. The time for mercy ended. Roan arrived at my hotel suite less than an hour after the toxicology report had sealed my grim reality. He did not knock on the door this time. He simply tapped a rhythmic, hollow code against the wood, a signal we had established during our brief meeting in the subterranean garage. I opened the door to find him standing in the dimly lit hallway, his imposing frame casting a long shadow across the carpet. He stepped inside, sweeping the room with a practiced, calculating gaze, before reaching into the deep pocket of his dark tactical jacket. He withdrew a small, heavy, matte black USB drive and placed it gently onto the center of the glass dining table. He did not offer any dramatic proclamations or unnecessary commentary. He simply nodded, his eyes devoid of any judgment, and told me that the extraction was completely successful. The feeds from the executive suite and the luxury sports car were fully secured and encrypted on that drive. Before I could even offer him a word of gratitude, Roan turned and walked out of the room, pulling the door shut behind him. The mechanical click of the latch echoed through the quiet space, leaving me entirely alone with the digital ghost of my destroying family. I sat down at the table, staring at the small black device. My hands, completely steady now that the toxic chemicals were systematically draining from my bloodstream, picked up the drive. I plugged it into the side port of my laptop. A prompt immediately flashed across the screen, demanding the complex alphanumeric decryption sequence Roan had provided. I typed the characters with deliberate, heavy keystrokes. The progress bar loaded, filling the screen with a sterile green light, and then the master folder opened. It was meticulously organized, categorized by day, time, and specific location. There were dozens of audio files spanning the last 72 hours. I scrolled past the files labeled with the make and model of Spencer's car, bypassing the morning commutes and the afternoon phone calls. I was searching for the files originating from his executive office, the inner sanctum, where I assumed he was coordinating the final lethal stages of his corporate embezzlement. I located a file flagged from late Friday night, hours after the rest of the corporate staff would have abandoned the building for the weekend. The timestamp indicated it began shortly before midnight. I assumed Spencer was working late, moving stolen funds through international servers under the cover of darkness. I connected my noise-canceling headphones, adjusted the volume, and pressed play. I leaned back in my chair, fully preparing myself to hear the cold, numerical logistics of my financial ruin. The audio quality was terrifyingly crisp, capturing the ambient acoustics of the expansive room. I heard the heavy, familiar thud of the solid mahogany office door closing shut. Then a sharp metallic click followed. It was the distinct sound of the deadbolt locking from the inside. A strange, suffocating silence stretched across the recording for several agonizing seconds. I expected to hear the clatter of a keyboard or the rustle of ledger pages. Instead, I heard the soft, unmistakable sound of a heavy sigh. Then came the whispering. It was Vivian. Her voice was low, breathless, and saturated with a sickening, intimate familiarity. I froze, my heart seizing in my chest as I listened. She murmured Spencer's name, drawing the syllables out in a slow, agonizing purr. I heard the rustling of expensive fabric, the distinct sound of a silk blouse slipping against leather upholstery. Then Spencer responded. His voice was thick with raw, unfiltered desire. The horrifying reality of what I was listening to slammed into my mind with the destructive force of a freight train. This was not a clandestine business meeting to discuss offshore shell corporations. This was not a logistical strategy session about my impending psychiatric commitment. This was a grotesque, depraved manifestation of ultimate betrayal. My 45-year-old wife and my 42-year-old stepson were carrying on a disgusting affair right inside the walls of my own company. I sat paralyzed, physically unable to tear the headphones away from my ears as the audio painted a graphic, undeniable picture of their absolute moral decay. I heard them moving across the room, knocking what sounded like a heavy crystal decanter off the corner of the executive desk. They were completely uninhibited, laughing softly as they discarded their clothing. The sounds of their intimacy echoed through the pristine audio feed, mingling with their hushed, mocking conversations. Between heavy breaths, Vivian whispered about how incredibly gullible I was, how pathetic it was watching me tremble in my chair while she handed me my nightly poison. Spencer laughed, a cruel, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. He told her how much he loved watching her play the devoted wife, praising her for being such a brilliant, ruthless actress. The betrayal ripped through me, severing every remaining tether of humanity I possessed. The financial theft, the corporate coup, even the systematic chemical poisoning, paled in comparison to the sheer repulsive sickness of this specific revelation. They were not just stealing my money. They were making an absolute, utter mockery of my life, my home, and my marriage. They were defiling the very concept of our family. A sudden violent wave of nausea surged from the pit of my stomach. I ripped the headphones off my ears, the plastic cracking against the edge of the glass table as I threw them down. I scrambled out of my chair, my vision swimming with dark, blinding spots. I barely made it to the sterile hotel bathroom before I collapsed onto the cold tile floor, violently emptying my stomach into the porcelain bowl. I stayed there for a long time, my chest heaving, my throat burning with stomach acid and unspeakable disgust. The cold tile offered no comfort. The horrifying sounds of their laughter continued to loop relentlessly inside my head. The ultimate depths of their depravity were completely incomprehensible. I had welcomed Spencer into my home. I had paid for his education. I had handed him the keys to a billion-dollar empire. I had loved Vivian with an absolute, unconditional devotion. I had trusted her with my health, my secrets, and my life. And they had repaid that devotion by poisoning my body and turning my marriage bed into a sick, twisted joke. I slowly pushed myself up from the floor, my muscles aching with a profound, exhausted tension. I turned on the brass faucet and splashed freezing cold water over my face, scrubbing at my skin until it was raw and red. I grabbed a rough white towel and dried my face, lifting my gaze to meet my own reflection in the mirror. The man looking back at me was completely transformed. The shocked, grieving husband was dead, buried under a mountain of undeniable audio evidence and toxicological reports. The loving father, who had desperately wanted to believe in the goodness of his family, was gone forever. Only the absolute ruthless predator remained. I walked back out of the bathroom, my steps slow but heavy with purpose. The sterile hotel room felt different now. It was no longer a cage, it was a war room. I sat back down at the glass dining table, staring at the plastic headphones resting exactly where I had thrown them. The initial shock of their grotesque affair had burned away the last remnants of my naive compassion. I picked up the headphones, placing them over my ears with deliberate precision. I reached for the laptop trackpad and hit play, bracing myself for the rest of their conversation. The audio resumed. Their breathless laughter slowly subsided, giving way to the clinking of crystal glasses and the pouring of expensive scotch. Spencer cleared his throat, his voice returning to that arrogant professional cadence he used in board meetings. He began detailing his ultimate financial strategy, and the sheer scale of his treason was staggering. He was not merely siphoning operating capital into Nevada shell companies to slowly drain Whitlock Development. He was engineering a complete, catastrophic detonation of my entire corporate legacy. Spencer was actively negotiating a hostile backroom takeover with Halstead Holdings Group, my oldest and most aggressive corporate rival. For 40 years, I had fought Halstead tooth and nail for every major commercial zoning contract in the Detroit metropolitan area. Now, my own stepson was handing them the keys to the castle. Spencer was arranging to sell my entire commercial real estate portfolio to Halstead for literal pennies on the dollar. He was intentionally tanking the company valuation to facilitate a rapid, undeniable liquidation of the assets. In exchange for essentially gifting my empire to my worst enemy, Spencer was receiving an astronomical, untraceable kickback. I listened as he smugly recited the routing numbers for a series of offshore accounts located in the Bahamas and Malta. Halstead Holdings Group was quietly wiring him precisely $20 million in untaxed, invisible funds as a reward for his corporate espionage. Spencer boasted to Vivian about how easy it was to manipulate the board of directors. He explained that by fabricating catastrophic quarterly losses, he would convince the executive committee that selling to Halstead was the only viable strategy to avoid total bankruptcy. He was manufacturing a corporate panic, using my supposed mental decline as the ultimate excuse for the sudden, inexplicable corporate vulnerability. The board would absolutely panic. Vivian let out a high, delighted laugh, the sound grating against my eardrums like broken glass. She praised his brilliance, stroking his ego with sickening devotion. Then the conversation shifted back to me. They began to openly mock my deteriorating state, laughing at how easily I had surrendered my agency. Vivian bragged about her meticulous nightly routine. She described with chilling enthusiasm exactly how she crushed the heavy sedatives using a marble mortar and pestle before dissolving the powder into a splash of warm water. She explained how she would then blend the toxic mixture into my fresh orange juice, marveling at how the citrus pulp perfectly masked the bitter chemical taste. She called me a pathetic, trusting old fool. She said it was almost too easy. She proudly recounted the moment I dropped my pen during the legal mediation earlier that week. She described the profound satisfaction she felt, watching my hands tremble, knowing she was the architect of my physical destruction. Spencer joined in the cruel laughter, remarking on how easily I had bought into the narrative of my own insanity. They were practically giddy with their success. They had weaponized my love, my trust, and my age against me, turning my gradual decay into an inside joke. The level of sociopathy required to poison a man while smiling in his face was incomprehensible. Yet I was listening to it unfold in high-definition audio. My hands clenched into tight fists on the table, my knuckles turning white, but my breathing remained controlled. Then Spencer laid out the final timeline. The Nevada transfers were nearly complete, and the Halstead Holdings buyout was scheduled to close within the week. But to finalize the ultimate transfer of assets, they needed my absolute, irrevocable incapacitation. Spencer explained that the temporary conservatorship was not enough to push the sale past the remaining skeptical board members. They needed me permanently removed from the public eye. Vivian enthusiastically agreed, detailing her consultation with a highly compromised private psychiatrist she had paid off. They had arranged for a specialized transport team to arrive at my hotel early next Monday morning. The plan was terrifyingly simple. They would have me forcefully committed to a locked, high-security state psychiatric facility before I could speak. Vivian explained that this specific facility was notorious for its heavily sedated population and absolute restriction on outside communication. Once I was locked behind those reinforced doors, I would be legally classified as a severe danger to myself. I would not be allowed a phone, a lawyer, or a single visitor without her explicit written consent. Spencer added that the medical staff at the facility had already been briefed on my violent outbursts and severe dementia. Any protest I made, any accusation of poisoning or embezzlement, would simply be documented as a tragic, textbook symptom of my paranoid delirium. I would scream the absolute truth into the void, and my captors would just increase my medication until my mind finally snapped. I would simply cease to exist. With me permanently buried in a locked ward, Spencer would have the absolute legal authority to sign over the final property deeds to Halstead Holdings Group. Once the ink dried and the offshore kickbacks cleared the international banking monitors, their ultimate escape would begin. Spencer outlined their flight path. They were not planning to stay in Detroit to enjoy their stolen wealth. They knew Gideon Vance or some other loyalist might eventually connect the dots. Instead, they had already purchased secondary passports. They were fleeing the country next Friday, escaping to a luxury villa they had secretly acquired in a remote, lawless foreign territory in South America. They would vanish like ghosts, living out their days in absolute luxury, while I rotted alone in a cold, sterile room. The audio file ended with the sound of them clinking their crystal glasses together, toasting to their brilliant future. The recording cut out, leaving a heavy static silence ringing in my ears. I slowly reached up and removed the headphones, setting them down on the glass table. I did not move for a long time. I sat in the dim light of the hotel suite, absorbing the sheer, unfathomable magnitude of their plot. They had built a perfect, inescapable maze, designed to strip me of my wealth, my freedom, and my sanity. They had viewed me not as a loving husband or a devoted father, but as a temporary obstacle to be dismantled and permanently discarded. The betrayal was so absolute, so fundamentally evil, that it completely severed any lingering emotional attachment I had left for either of them. They had given me a deadline. I had exactly 5 days before the transport team arrived. 5 days to systematically burn their entire world to the ground. I stared at the glowing screen of my laptop. There was one final audio file remaining in the encrypted folder Roan had provided. It was a short recording, captured just as Spencer and Vivian were preparing to leave the executive suite. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, staring at the small play icon on the monitor. My mind and body were already pushed to the absolute limits of human endurance by the devastating revelations of their financial treason and their grotesque affair. I did not want to put the heavy plastic headphones back on. I did not want to hear another single syllable of their toxic, arrogant voices echoing inside my head. But the primal protective instinct that had violently awakened inside me demanded total, uncompromising clarity. I needed to know every single detail of their meticulously planned endgame. I desperately needed to know if they had discussed the one thing in my life that mattered more than my commercial real estate empire, my wealth, or my freedom. I picked up the headphones, slid them slowly over my ears, and pressed the play button for the very last time. The audio immediately hissed with the ambient late-night noise of the dark office. I heard the distinct, familiar sound of Spencer sliding his arms into his tailored suit jacket, preparing to depart. "Are we entirely sure we have covered every single loose end?" Spencer asked, his voice echoing slightly in the empty room. "The corporate accounts are draining perfectly on schedule. The Halstead Holdings buyout is completely locked in. The psychiatric transport team is confirmed for early Monday morning. Is there absolutely anything else we are forgetting to handle before we leave for the private airport on Friday?" A brief, chilling silence followed his question. Then Vivienne spoke. Her voice lacked the breathy, seductive tone she had used just moments earlier. It was flat, deeply annoyed, and terribly cold. "We need to figure out exactly what we are going to do with Elsie," she said. Hearing my 10-year-old daughter's beautiful name, spoken by that treacherous woman, sent a violent physical shockwave through my entire nervous system. Spencer sighed heavily into the microphone, sounding exactly as if they were merely discussing a minor logistical annoyance, like a delayed construction shipment or a misfiled corporate tax return. "Right," he muttered dismissively. "The kid. We cannot exactly leave her alone in the massive estate once the old man is permanently hauled off to the locked psychiatric ward. The state government will immediately step in and assign a nosy caseworker. They will start asking uncomfortable questions we do not want to answer, while the wire transfers are still clearing the international monitors." Vivienne let out a sharp, derisive scoff that made the blood run cold in my veins. "Do not worry about the brat," she said, her tone dripping with unadulterated venom. "I have already made all the necessary arrangements. The exact moment the old man is safely locked away and legally declared incompetent by the court, I am instantly executing my legal authority as her custodial stepmother. I have already enrolled her in a highly obscure, remote disciplinary boarding school located just outside of Lucerne. The isolated facility specializes exclusively in troubled children with severe behavioral issues. It is essentially a high-altitude juvenile prison with incredibly strict, ironclad communication blackouts. I am putting her on a direct, unescorted commercial flight to Switzerland on Tuesday morning." "And what if she puts up a massive fight?" Spencer asked, sounding slightly concerned. "What if she starts screaming and telling the boarding school medical staff that we intentionally poisoned her father?" Vivienne laughed, a cruel, soulless, wicked sound that echoed loudly in the quiet office. "Let her talk," she sneered. "She is just a grieving, deeply traumatized child who supposedly just watched her father lose his mind to aggressive dementia. Absolutely no one will believe a single desperate word she says. They will just heavily sedate her and lock her in a dark dormitory. And honestly, Spencer, if the Swiss boarding school somehow refuses to keep her, or if the international travel logistics become too complicated before our outbound flight on Friday, I will simply sign over my guardianship rights directly to the state foster system. I do not care what happens to her. I am completely done playing the loving mother to his pathetic little spawn." The audio file ended abruptly, with the sharp click of the executive suite light switch being turned off, followed instantly by the heavy, echoing thud of the solid mahogany door slamming firmly shut. I sat perfectly frozen in the dim light of my hotel room. The silence that filled the beige suite was no longer empty or hollow. It was thick, heavy, and deeply suffocating me with the sheer unfathomable magnitude of their cruelty. They were not just going to steal the entirety of my life's work. They were not just going to lock me in a sterile psychiatric ward to rot in isolation until my failing heart finally stopped beating. They were going to casually throw my little girl away like a piece of discarded, worthless garbage. They were going to permanently banish a brilliant, innocent, loving 10-year-old child to a disciplinary prison across the ocean, or intentionally abandon her to the brutal mercy of the overcrowded state foster care system. My breathing slowly regulated, settling into a deep, rhythmic, terrifying cadence. The violent nausea and the dizzying shock that had overwhelmed me earlier were completely, entirely gone. In their place, a terrifying, absolute calm washed completely over my recovering mind. Every lingering shred of mercy, every microscopic drop of pity or hesitation I might have harbored for the treacherous woman I once called my wife, or the greedy boy I had raised as my own son, instantly and permanently evaporated into the cold air. They had willingly crossed a moral boundary that could never, under any circumstances, be uncrossed. My sweet Elsie had risked her own physical safety to quietly slip that desperate warning note into my coat pocket. She had clearly seen the true faces of the monsters hiding in the shadows of our beautiful home, and she had bravely tried to save my life. Now it was my absolute, undeniable duty to save hers. I reached across the table and grabbed the cheap, disposable cellular phone resting on the glass surface. I firmly decided I did not need to wait 5 agonizing days. I did not need to cower in this depressing hotel room for another single second. The elaborate legal trap was already perfectly constructed, fully baited, and heavily armed with federal banking monitors. I aggressively dialed Gideon Vance's restricted burner number. He answered the call on the second ring, his gruff, experienced voice sounding perfectly steady in the darkness of the late night. "Gideon," I said, my voice resonating with a lethal, unwavering, freezing certainty that I had not possessed in over 6 months. "We are changing the plan and moving the entire timeline forward. The agonizing waiting period is officially over right now. I need you to initiate the banking alerts immediately. Spring the absolute trap." Gideon did not ask a single question. He simply confirmed the new directives and disconnected the line. The heavy gears of our hidden machine instantly locked into place, accelerating the inevitable collision. The very next morning, the sterile beige walls of my hotel room were replaced by the imposing polished oak panels of the county courthouse. The air inside the quiet courtroom was thick with a stifling, manufactured solemnity. I sat at the defendant's table, my posture intentionally slumped, my hands resting limply in my lap. I was wearing the same slightly oversized, wrinkled suit I had worn to the mediation session. I needed to maintain the tragic illusion until the absolute last possible second. Across the center aisle, Vivian and Spencer sat flanking their lead attorney. They looked like the perfect heartbroken family. Vivian wore a conservative navy dress, her makeup carefully applied to make her look exhausted from worry. Spencer sat rigidly, projecting the image of a devoted, overwhelmed son, burdened with an impossible choice. They believed they were walking into a mere formality, a simple rubber stamp from a sympathetic judge to finalize their total victory. They had no idea they had just walked into a slaughterhouse. The presiding judge, A stern man with silver hair and a heavy black judicial robe peered down at the enormous stack of thick files resting on his elevated wooden bench. Vivian's lead counsel, a sharp, incredibly expensive litigator named Lionel Prescott, stood confidently at his podium and began his opening remarks. His loud voice echoed softly through the high ceilings, dripping with a sickening, highly rehearsed sorrow. He spoke at length of my massive legacy, acknowledging my 4 decades of absolute brilliance in the competitive commercial real estate sector, only to pivot sharply into a deeply disturbing narrative of my rapid, tragic cognitive decline. He formally submitted the heavy conservatorship petition, sliding a thick folder of completely forged medical evaluations across the polished wood. He cited numerous consultations with private psychiatrists, listing my fabricated symptoms with chilling clinical precision. He meticulously detailed the sudden memory lapses, the violent physical tremors, the severe paranoia, and the dangerous erratic behavior that supposedly threatened not only my own safety, but the overall stability of my billion-dollar corporation. Prescott explicitly painted a terrifying picture of a brilliant mind completely ravaged by an aggressive, untreatable form of early dementia. He officially requested that all of my legal, financial, and personal rights be permanently stripped away and transferred directly to my devoted wife and my highly capable stepson. I listened carefully to the entire fabricated medical history without moving a single muscle in my body. I did not protest loudly. I did not shake my head in angry denial. I simply stared at the blank wooden table directly in front of me, absorbing every single destructive lie they casually entered into the permanent official court record. The presiding judge softly requested a primary character witness to firmly corroborate the devastating medical claims explicitly outlined in the petition. Prescott immediately called Spencer to the wooden stand. My stepson confidently stood up, carefully buttoning his expensive tailored jacket, and walked slowly toward the elevated witness box. He raised his right hand high, swore a binding legal oath to tell the absolute truth under the severe penalty of perjury, and took his leather seat. What followed next was a dramatic performance so perfectly calibrated, so utterly devoid of actual genuine human emotion, that it was truly terrifying to witness. Spencer looked directly at the judge, his eyes rapidly welling up with meticulously forced tears. He spoke in a shaky, hesitant voice, describing exactly how much he absolutely loved me. He told the quiet court how I had raised him since childhood, how I had taught him everything he currently knew about international business, and how I had always been his greatest personal hero. He paused dramatically, gently wiping a stray tear from his cheek with a pristine white cloth handkerchief before describing the profound, shattering heartbreak of helplessly watching his beloved hero slowly decay. He passionately recounted entirely fictional, violent incidents where I had supposedly forgotten my own given name, where I had aimlessly wandered the sprawling estate in a blind nighttime panic, and where I had violently lashed out at the innocent nursing staff Vivian had supposedly hired to protect me. He openly begged the compassionate judge to deeply understand that this extreme legal action was born out of pure, desperate family love. He claimed they urgently needed total legal control of my massive assets, strictly to fund my long-term medical care in a highly specialized, absolutely secure psychiatric facility. He was shamelessly lying straight through his teeth, weaving a completely fraudulent, highly manipulative narrative while under a sworn federal oath. He was intentionally, legally perjuring his own criminal self with every single poisonous syllable that confidently left his mouth, and I completely let him do it. I sat silently in my stiff wooden chair and watched him happily dig his own massive grave with a golden shovel. I knew the crystal-clear audio recordings of him and Vivian actively laughing about poisoning my nightly orange juice were resting securely inside Gideon Vance's battered leather briefcase, positioned just a few short feet behind me in the crowded gallery. I knew the official toxicology reports, explicitly detailing the lethal toxic levels of heavy metals and off-market synthetic sedatives hiding in my bloodstream, were fully authenticated and completely ready to be unsealed. I knew the Federal Banking Commission had already successfully frozen the offshore accounts holding Spencer's illicit $20 million corporate kickback. I knew every single terrifying thing they currently did not know. I patiently let Spencer spin his elaborate, disgusting web of dark deceit, because the legal penalty for attempting to steal a corporation was severe. But the ultimate penalty for organized embezzlement, attempted homicide, and felony perjury was absolute, total, inescapable ruin. Spencer finally finished his tragic, lengthy monologue, dramatically lowering his head and weeping softly into his hands. Vivian let out a quiet, supportive sob from the petitioner's table, gently dabbing at her completely dry eyes. The entire courtroom was completely silent, entirely captivated by the flawless, heartbreaking theatrical performance. Even the seasoned court reporter looked visibly moved by the deeply emotional display. The judge let out a long, heavy sigh, slowly adjusting his silver glasses as he looked down at me from his high bench. His tired eyes were filled with a profound, crushing pity. He saw exactly what they had paid him to see. He saw a completely broken, hollow, senile old man who no longer possessed the basic mental capacity to govern his own life or protect his own massive fortune. He slowly gathered the stack of conservatorship documents, carefully aligning the edges of the paper with a dull, rhythmic tap against the solid wood. He reached for his heavy wooden gavel, clearing his throat as he prepared to deliver the final ruling that would permanently strip away my freedom, my wealth, and my entire future. He was preparing to formally strike the gavel and end my life as a free man, entirely unaware that the trial had not even begun. The heavy wooden gavel hovered in the tense, silent air. The judge drew a deep breath, his eyes filled with tragic pity as he prepared to deliver the fatal blow to my independence. I braced my shoulders, my hand sliding toward the pocket where my audio drive was concealed. I was exactly 1 second away from detonating my defense when a small, determined voice echoed from the heavy oak doors at the back of the gallery. "Wait. Please wait." The judge froze, his arms suspended in midair. Every single head in the cavernous courtroom turned simultaneously toward the sudden interruption. Standing in the center aisle, clutching a battered pink tablet to her chest, was my 10-year-old daughter, Elsie. Beside her stood a stern state social worker, whom Vivian had likely brought to facilitate Elsie's immediate transfer to the foster system. Elsie looked tiny in the imposing chamber, but her dark eyes blazed with fierce courage. She took a hesitant step forward and looked directly up at the bench. "May I show you something that Dad does not know about, Your Honor?" Elsie asked, her voice trembling slightly, but carrying clearly across the silence. The reaction from the petitioner's table was violent. Vivian shot up from her chair with the frantic energy of a cornered predator. Her mask of the grieving wife evaporated, replaced by pure, unfiltered panic. She let out a guttural scream and lunged across the aisle, desperately reaching to snatch the tablet from my daughter. But she never made it past the swinging gate. The armed bailiff intercepted her with terrifying speed, blocking her advance. He placed an authoritative hand onto Vivienne's chest, physically forcing her backward until she stumbled heavily back into her seat. "Sit down and remain silent, ma'am," the bailiff ordered with absolute authority. The judge slowly lowered his heavy gavel, placing it gently down onto his desk. The pity in his tired eyes vanished, replaced by a sharp, calculating judicial scrutiny. He clearly recognized the unmistakable terror radiating from Vivienne's sweating face. He leaned forward, looking down at my brave little girl with a remarkably gentle expression. "You may approach the bench, young lady," the judge said softly, completely ignoring Prescott's frantic legal objections. "Bailiff, please assist the child with the equipment." I sat frozen at the defendant's table, my heart hammering against my rib cage. I had spent 5 days building an ironclad trap, gathering audio recordings and medical reports. I had no idea what my daughter was holding in her trembling hands. Elsie walked past my table, offering me a brave smile before approaching the stand. The bailiff gently took the tablet and expertly connected the cables to the courtroom's monitor system. 4 massive digital screens, suspended from the high ceiling, suddenly flickered to life. Elsie reached forward and pressed a single button on the screen. The video footage immediately began to play. It was slightly grainy, framed by a rounded border, but the visual content was clear. I instantly recognized the expensive marble countertops and the custom cherrywood cabinets. It was the primary kitchen of our sprawling luxury estate. The unique elevated camera angle was distinctly recognizable. The lens was recording directly from the glass eye of the brown teddy bear I had won for Elsie years ago, the same bear she kept perched next to the fruit bowl. The timestamp glowing in the corner indicated that the footage had been captured nearly 3 months ago, late in the evening. The courtroom watched in breathless silence as Vivienne walked casually into the frame. She was wearing her emerald green silk robe, her hair tied back in a loose knot. She walked over to the medicine cabinet, but she did not reach for the standard vitamin bottles. Instead, she reached behind a row of ceramic mugs and pulled out a small amber vial. A horrified gasp echoed through the gallery as Vivienne dumped a pile of thick white pills into a heavy marble mortar. The microphone perfectly captured the sharp grinding sounds of the heavy pestle as she crushed the lethal medication into a fine powder. She poured a tall glass of freshly squeezed orange juice, carefully scraping every single granule of the toxic substance directly into the liquid. She grabbed a silver spoon and stirred the poisonous cocktail with a sickeningly mundane rhythm. Before she could pick up the poisoned drink, the kitchen door quietly opened. Spencer confidently strolled into the wide camera frame. He was wearing his tailored business suit, his silk tie slightly loosened. He walked up behind his stepmother, sliding his arms possessively around her narrow waist. The entire courtroom watched in sheer revulsion as Vivienne turned around and leaned into his embrace. They kissed passionately, a deeply intimate exchange that completely shattered the foundation of their fabricated family dynamic. The undeniable truth of their affair was now broadcast across 4 massive screens in a federal courthouse. Spencer pulled back from the disgusting embrace, an incredibly arrogant smirk spreading across his handsome face. He looked down at the tall glass of tainted orange juice resting on the marble counter, his eyes gleaming with predatory satisfaction. He reached out casually, tracing his index finger along the damp rim of the glass. "When the old man's brain completely rots, I will sign the estate over to you," Spencer laughed, his voice dripping with concentrated malice. The video file abruptly ended. the massive screens instantly turning black. The courtroom was suddenly plunged into an absolute, deafening, suffocating silence. The judge sat frozen behind his bench, his face drained of color, his expression transformed into a rigid mask of pure horror and professional outrage. He stared blankly at the dark monitors, his hands gripping the edges of his desk so tightly, his knuckles were white. I slowly turned my head and looked directly across the center aisle. The arrogant, untouchable facade that Vivienne and Spencer had meticulously maintained for the last 6 months had been completely, utterly annihilated in less than 2 minutes. Vivienne was violently shaking, her mouth opening and closing as she desperately tried to drag oxygen into her constricted lungs. Her face was a sickly, ghostly, translucent white, completely devoid of any blood or life. She looked like a decaying corpse, sitting rigidly in a tailored navy dress. Spencer was in a state of absolute catastrophic shock. The confident, brilliant young executive who had just delivered a flawlessly perjured, tearful testimony minutes earlier was entirely gone. He dropped heavily backward into his padded leather chair, his long legs giving out completely. He stared blankly ahead at the dark screens, his jaw hanging completely slack, his chest heaving with rapid, shallow, terrified breaths. His expensive corporate lawyer, Prescott, physically recoiled from his own clients, taking a very large, deliberate step away from the petitioner's table, as if he had suddenly realized he was standing far too close to a highly contagious disease. The ultimate trap had finally been fully sprung, not by my highly paid private investigators or my elite corporate attorneys, but by the brilliant, unbroken spirit of a brave 10-year-old girl who simply refused to let her father be destroyed in the dark. The silence in the courtroom broke into utter, uncontrollable chaos. The heavy, suffocating tension that had gripped the room instantly shattered as the massive digital screens faded to black. I stood up slowly from the solid oak defense table. My hands were not trembling. My posture was perfectly straight, my shoulders squared with reclaimed strength, my eyes locked directly onto Spencer and Vivienne with the cold, lethal precision of a man who had just decisively won a brutal war. I turned slightly and offered a firm, barely perceptible nod to my lead attorney, Gideon Vance. Gideon stepped forward smoothly, opening his battered leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick stack of documents and dropped them heavily onto the judge's elevated wooden bench. The resounding thud echoed above the rising panic in the gallery. These were not fabricated psychiatric evaluations. They were the certified official toxicology reports, proving the lethal chemical saturation in my bloodstream. The offshore banking traces, outlining the $20 million kickback, and the irrevocable trust documents, securing my entire corporate empire. Your Honor, Gideon stated, his commanding voice easily cutting through the frantic, escalating panic of the opposing counsel. My client is absolutely not suffering from any form of dementia. He is the deliberate victim of systematic long-term chemical poisoning, international wire fraud, and calculated attempted murder. Before Vivienne's expensive lawyer could even open his mouth to formulate a desperate, stammering objection, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a violent crash. 2 grim federal agents and a senior investigator from the Financial Crimes Division stepped confidently inside the chamber. Gideon had secretly handed them the pristine audio tapes and the digital audit logs 3 days ago, ensuring the trap was completely inescapable. Spencer saw the federal badges and instantly panicked. He scrambled out of his leather chair and tried to make a desperate, frantic run for the side emergency exit. He did not make it 3 steps. The armed bailiff lunged forward, tackling my stepson to the polished marble floor with a heavy, sickening thud. Vivienne collapsed backward into her chair, her sophisticated facade completely disintegrating. She started screaming, her voice cracking as she begged me to tell them it was all a terrible misunderstanding. She desperately tried to use that same sweet, toxic, soothing tone she had used while serving me poisoned juice. I did not even look at her. I simply stood my ground, my face carved from stone, watching the absolute destruction of her pathetic lies. The presiding judge slammed his gavel down, immediately restoring order. He sternly revoked all of Vivienne's temporary rights on the spot, granted me full and sole protective custody of Elsie, and furiously signed the federal arrest warrants without a single moment of hesitation. I stood in cold silence and watched as the heavy steel handcuffs clicked sharply around Vivienne's trembling wrists. I watched as Spencer, the arrogant boy I had personally mentored and foolishly trusted with my life's legacy, was physically dragged out of the courtroom in absolute humiliated tears. He was now facing decades in federal prison for racketeering, wire fraud, and criminal conspiracy. They genuinely thought they were burying a clueless, pathetic old man. Instead, they had eagerly dug their own inescapable graves. With the federal agents clearing the room of the treacherous monsters, I slowly walked over to the wooden witness box and knelt down on the floor. I opened my arms and pulled my brilliant little girl into a tight, desperate hug, burying my face in her shoulder as she cried tears of profound relief. The suffocating darkness that plagued my mind was finally lifted, replaced by the bright light of unvarnished truth. I had lost a treacherous wife and a dangerous stepson to their greed, but I saved my life, secured my empire, and protected the only family that truly mattered. Betrayal rarely comes from your enemies. It wears the face of those you feed and protect. When you spend your life building an empire and providing for your family, never let your generosity blind your instincts. Trust is a beautiful thing, but blind trust is a dangerous liability. Always keep a firm hand on the steering wheel of your own life, your finances, and your health. The moment someone tries to isolate you for your own good, that is the moment you must fight back the hardest. Protect your legacy, but most importantly, protect the innocent who depend on you. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit the like button and subscribe right now. Have you ever caught someone plotting behind your back? Tell me exactly how you handled the betrayal in the comments below. I will see you in the very next story video.